Hi, I'm Christopher Golden. This is The Writer's Life. Today we're in conversation with legendary artist, writer, and film historian Stephen R. Bissette. This is the second time we've done this, but even though it's only the second time, it's going to be a little bit different than the first time. We're in conversation today rather than just me interviewing Steve, because we have a joint project coming up that we want to tell you about, and then we'll also talk about another book Steve has coming up today. Steve.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Chris?
I'm good. This is an interesting, it's an interesting conversation to have, because I wanted to open up by recounting my first meeting with you.
Nikon.
No,
before that.
Before we met at Nikon.
Okay, Nikon being a horror writers conference.
It's a horror writers convention, Northeast Writers Convention in Rhode Island every year. This year, for the first time, it'll be in Salem,
So we must have first met
Massachusetts.
at a convention or a comic shop?
At your house.
Oh, yes, that's right.
I was 22 years old.
That's right.
And a mutual friend of ours, Phil Nutman, brought me up to your house, and I'd never seen so many videotapes in my life.
And we are pikers compared to...
I mean, just blown away. And you've never failed to impress me with the encyclopedic level of your knowledge of all kinds of film history, but especially the history of horror films. And so because the project we're going to talk about mostly today is Studio of Screams, the Blythewood Horror Omnibus, the idea came from a writer named Stephen Volk. And even though I know Steve, with your knowledge, why don't you explain who Stephen Volk is?
Okay, Stephen Volk is a British novelist, short story writer, archivist, screenwriter, teleplay author. He's worked for British television. He's worked for film studios. He's been published all over the place. And I first became cognizant of Stephen's work when he had worked with the late British director Ken Russell, the man who did Women in Love and The Devils back in the late 60s, early 70s. And Stephen collaborated with Ken Russell on a movie called Gothic,
right,
where the whole premise was a pretty flamboyant dramatization of the trip in which Mary Shelley ended up writing Frankenstein.
Right.
What was the genesis of the young woman Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein?
It's a pretty crazy movie.
It's an insane movie.
And the weird thing is that watching that movie and knowing Steve Volk, it's hard for me to make the two go together.
Yeah, who would throw more dead babies at the camera, Stephen or Ken? I think Ken Russell.
Ken Russell would, yeah. So Steve is a funny, also serious, sort of sedate Welshman who I love very much. But Gothic is a weird.
It is, and I tend to think. I mean, with now we're talking. Gothic came out in the mid '80s. We're talking now. What, 30, 40 years, reading and being able to catch up with more of the work that Stephen had done over the years. I most often think of Ghostwatch as being more representative of his work. Ghostwatch was a BBC production that was sort of a stunt. It was kind of the BBC's version of the Orson Welles War of the Worlds. Right. And Stephen and his collaborators in that project, the director, the producer, schemed pulling a prank on the British public to tell a ghost story. And it was presented as like a live news broadcast. I believe it was Halloween week.
I think it was.
Or Halloween night even, perhaps.
Halloween night, I think, actually.
And it revolved around a fictionalization of the famous Enfield ghost case of a single mother, two kids, two daughters, and sort of poltergeist activity that was happening in a home. And they extrapolate from the real case history to present this fictionalized version of it, interjecting BBC journalists and reporters who are on the scene and cross-cutting between...
And using actual presenters from the BBC.
Yeah, like the biggest newscaster in England.
It would be like if you did it today and you used, Brian Williams and Robin Roberts, or, and well-known news figures.
Well, and given the news figure they went with, it would be more like, if in the 60s or 70s you'd actually managed to convince Walter Cronkite
in those days. I was trying
or
to
a
think
Mike
of
Wallace,
modern, contemporary versions.
And it so freaked people out that the BBC never broadcast it again. They never replayed it. And I finally got to see it thanks to a DVD that came out 10 years or so ago. They finally released it publicly, and it's brilliant.
Yeah. I saw it recently on Shudder in the U.S. It's a streaming service that's related to Amazon. And I think actually that it's instructive to talk about Ghost Watch, even though Steve has gone on to do other extraordinary things. He wrote the film The Awakening, which I think is a brilliant ghost story. He did a TV series in the UK that's available here called Afterlife, which is
a great
such
series.
A great show. All sort of classy ghost story things, but Ghost Watch in particular is instructive today because of this project. So Steve Volk, and I'm not sure if we've talked too much about it. So Steve Volk talked to Mark Morris, another sort of legendary British horror writer.
And Mark Morris, for the benefit of the audience, is a Doctor Who devotee.
Yes.
You've co-authored books with Mark.
I co-authored last year the novelization of the recent Predator film. So we took the screenplay and turned it into a novel. And so, let's talk about that and then talk about Studio Screams.
Yeah, and Mark also has done multimedia projects. Like Mark was one of the movers and shakers in taking this low-budget British horror film that was released here in America as Blood on Satan's Claw and adapting it into a radio drama, essentially, that was released on CD, and it won an award either last year or the year before, the year it came out, as Best Dramatic Presentation.
Yep. He's just won another.
It's terrific. So Mark and Steve were sort of the two who put their heads together.
Had this concept inspired by. So let's talk a little bit about. So when I was growing up.
And you're a pup.
And I'm a pup. I'll be 53 this year. But growing up in Massachusetts, creature feature and creature double feature were my bread and butter. Not my bread, my lifeblood.
Okay.
My brother and I, he's just 2 years older than I am, loved all of these horror movies and all these old horror movies from across the spectrum so much that there was a big color console TV in our playroom in the basement. And we would move on Saturdays and Sundays, we'd move the black and white TV from upstairs and we would put it on top of the color console TV because on Channel 38 and Channel 56, there would sometimes be two different monster movies at the same time. So we could sometimes watch both. And so up until about 10 years ago, I wasn't sure what was Day of the Triffids and what was the Mole People because their scenes from Mole People had made their way into my memory of the Day of the Triffids because we watched them simultaneously. And so
this explains a lot.
It explains a lot. So the thing is that's how I, as an American kid, fell in love with, in particular, Hammer Films and Amicus Films. Those are the two studios that made the bulk of the crazy horror, and they made other things that was coming out in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so why don't you talk about the studios a little bit?
I'm a generation ahead of you, and so I'm the generation that actually grew up with the Hammer Films in theaters as well as on television.
And I envy that.
So, the year I was born, 1955, is the year that The Creeping Unknown, the first Quatermass film, was released by Hammer, and that was the beginning of their horror cycle. By the time I hit movie-going age, I was the generation that was asking their parents to take them to see movies. And actually, this book, the Hammer Horror Omnibus, features 4 novelizations of Hammer Films. And Hammer Films had just released Curse of the Mummy's Tomb and The Gorgon theatrically. And I actually convinced my parents to take me to see this double feature at our local theater in northern Vermont.
Right.
And So my younger sister had to come, and she is still traumatized by the Gorgon.
Well, that means you've done your job.
I've done my job, and
done your
I
job.
still don't understand why my parents just didn't grab us and pull us out of the theater a half hour into the first movie. But we stayed for both movies, and then I was
Because
told...
your parents knew what was good.
No, I was told I would never pick a movie out again in my life. And, you know, once I had my driver's license, the later Hammer films like Vampire Circus, Countess Dracula, Hands of the Ripper, those were playing at drive-ins.
Right.
And they were almost always double bills.
I mean, I can't express to you enough how envious I am.
Well,
because I had to discover those
On television.
and dramatically cut,
Right.
and with commercials on, you know, the local UHF stations as a kid. And then I didn't know until this project was suggested to me that at the time it wasn't as common in those days as it is now for movies to have novelizations where a writer, novelist will take the script of the film and turn it into a novel. And Hammer did these 2 books in which they took 4 of their individual films and did short novelizations for 4 of them to have that. And we'll, you know...
and these were only available in England. I mean, these are not books that I could pick up on the paperback racks here in America the way some of the other Hammer paperbacks, you know, I've brought by and that we've got on the table in front of us. These we could buy at the local stand. These
Right.
were only available in England. And I later got my hands on them in used paperback shops.
Right.
Where you'd find books from England
Right.
and Canada and
But
Australia.
you did find them in the U.S.
I found these I found this one in a used paperback shop in Florida.
Okay.
And I found the second one in a used paperback shop in Maine. You know, because
Fantastic.
people travel, or a
Sure.
family member mailed it to
Right.
somebody or whatever. And let's explain novelizations, and then let's explain Hammer and Amicus, because you
Okay,
refer to
yeah,
them. So
yeah.
novelizations, I mean, these are paperbacks from my youth. These are 2 Hammer films, The Horror of Dracula, Phantom of the Opera. These are just reissues of the original novels by
Right.
Bram Stoker, by Gaston Leroux, with tie-in photo covers.
Photos from the films.
Right.
But those aren't novelizations.
And these are
in the
not
sense, right,
novelizations.
exactly.
Novelizations are an author was contracted to work from the screenplay.
Right.
The novelizations often have material that aren't in the final films.
Right.
Because they're working from a working screenplay that was altered during filming, or the censors cut material or whatever. So the novelizations are interesting to a film scholar like myself because, here's clues as to what the film was supposed to be.
Right. Before the studio decided that they needed to cut certain
Right.
things.
Now,
or-
you've done novelization paperbacks.
I've done 2. I did with Mark Morris. I did The Predator and or
The most
Predator,
recent
most
Predator
recent
movie.
one, and then I did Peter Jackson's King Kong.
And how did you do those, Chris?
Well,
Like, what's given to you?
So we'll talk briefly about
Yeah.
the King. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but they would not release the script, so I had to actually fly to California and sit in a locked room with the one copy, this is true, the one copy of the screenplay that Universal Studios had, which had the name of the president of the studio watermarked on every single page. And they expected that I was going to be taking notes. But taking notes meant that for 3 days, I transcribed the entire 180 page, which is, for those who are unfamiliar.
That's a massive screenplay.
It's a massive screenplay, a 180-page script by Peter Jackson onto my laptop. So I went home with the whole thing, and I used that as the basis for writing the novel. And interestingly enough, there are, as you say, there are many things in the novelization that are not in the finished film because they were in the script. And there are a number of things in the finished film that were
weren't
not in the novelization
Right.
because either he left it out or because he didn't want anybody to know he was spending budget money on something, or he
Or
came
they-
up with it afterwards.
they changed their mind,
Right,
yeah,
they changed
yeah.
it. So the things are different. Anyway, we should talk about
Hammer.
Hammer and
Hammer Films was an independent producer of feature films and a little bit of television in Britain. They actually opened the studio that we grew up with the product of in the late 40s, early 50s.
Right.
They actually owned a property called Bray, which became Bray Studios, and they shot almost all their films in and around the building, the acreage, adjoining parks, and they had a very clever production team who would redress these buildings, these rooms, these sets. They often would shoot films back to back where they were using the same sets with very minor changes in a different cast and a different script. And
They were expert at stretching the shoestring
they
even
were
tighter.
expert, and they had like their own troupe of actors essentially. The same performers would appear again and again, and not just the performers the public recognizes like Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, those were their stars. It would be character players like Michael Ripper, who appears in like half the Hammer product from the 50s and 60s. And they were very successful, and not every film was successful. They had films that bombed, they had films that the censors squashed, but they had a real stream of breakthrough hits in the 50s and 60s. Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, which broke box office records around the world. And then their later double bills like The Reptile and Plague of the Zombies and Dracula Prince of Darkness and Rasputin the Mad Monk, and those were sold as double bills. And here in America, we got them usually from major studios. 20th Century Fox, Columbia, Universal would contract with Hammer for a certain amount of product. And as you mentioned earlier, they weren't all horror films. They did pirate movies, they did war movies, they did Viking, medieval, they did Robin Hood movies.
A lot of sort of crime,
a lot of crime
suspense
films,
yeah.
right. And they were huge. And their one competitor was an outfit called Amicus. Amicus is a joint partnership of two American producers, Max Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky. And Amicus began competing with Hammer in the mid-60s. And what set Amicus apart is they began doing anthology films, portmanteau films, which are films that will have 4 to 5 individual stories with a framing device.
People,
Tales from the Crypt.
Right, Tales from the Crypt, Creepshow is the thing probably people are...
Right, and Creepshow wasn't an Amicus film, but
no,
it's that type of film.
It was not an Amicus film, but it is a portmanteau.
Exactly.
It is an anthology film like that.
And it was a template that the British had established. It actually goes back to the silent era in German film, but the big breakthrough was a British studio, Ealing, made Dead of Night in 1945. That was an international hit. Great ghost movie.
Right.
And Amicus was building on that. And they started doing movies like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Torture Garden, The House That Dripped Blood. These were all movies that played in theaters, in drive-ins, and then popped up on television. I caught up with a lot of them on TV. Growing up. And
it's interesting, too, to me that people are familiar with Christopher Lee from the Lord of the Rings movies. They're familiar with
Star Wars.
From Star Wars, the later Star Wars films, and Peter Cushing from the original Star Wars.
From the first Star Wars, yeah.
But Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee were, they were, internationally recognized actors, but their real fame, their real stardom came from playing with Christopher Lee playing Dracula, with Peter Cushing playing Van Helsing.
And Dr.
Frankenstein,
yeah.
Both. It's just so.
And they both did films with Hammer,
Right.
and they both did films with Amicus.
Right. So it was the love of these movies
Right.
that springboarded Stephen Volk and Mark Morris to come up with this idea.
And they were specifically inspired by these
two books.
Right, the Hammer Horror Omnibus. This was their model.
Right. So the book is Studio of Screams, the Blythewood Horror Omnibus, and while in every other way we're going to be pretending that that these stories are real, I think for the purposes of this conversation we have to acknowledge that they're not real.
Well, they're real stories.
Yeah, they're real stories.
But they're not novelizations of real movies.
So they recruited first my friend and our friend and an amazing novelist in his own right, Tim Levin, and then me, the token American, and then...
I believe the term is token colonial.
Token colonial, yes, the token colonial. So basically, what we began with is this idea that we would imitate this book, these books, and we would come up with novels and novellas that would be written as if they were films produced by our fictional studio, Blythewood, as if Blythewood was a competitor for Hammer and Amicus in this era. And we would come up with the ideas for these movies, and we'd write the novellas as if we were novelizing movies that never existed in the first place. We had that conversation, and I said, well, if we're going to do this, the way to really sell it, to really have it go, to come across, in the right way, is to bring in Steve Bissette and have Steve do a piece, an interstitial sort of wraparound that weaves in with the stories to create the history of this fake studio so that it seemed like it was real. And so talk about that experience.
So it was quite a challenge, people are getting more used to these kind of fictional invented universes. We just recently had Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which does a very similar thing. Let's invent an actor who didn't exist in real world terms, but let's present, Rick Dalton as if he was a Western TV star from the early 60s who had a fumbling career and was trying to mount a comeback and went to Italy and shot spaghetti westerns. We were kind of doing something in that ballpark of an invented universe. The trick is seeding it with enough references to actual real world cinema, real world events, real world personalities that it's convincing. And the challenge and the fun for me was the idea of, okay, so people like us, meaning, Stephen, Mark, Tim, yourself, me, we have some grounding in these horror movies that we grew up with. Stephen Volk in particular, because he actually has written films that were produced.
Right.
But how do we sell this to a readership that may have no reference for Hammer and Amicus? And how do we make it believable? And the test for me on a lot of levels was, can I write something that my wife could read and be entertained by, enough to stay with reading it, but that I could also satisfy our friend Kim Newman, who knows more about British film history and the literature of the genre than any living person I know. And that became sort of the litmus test for me as I was working on it, like, how can this work? The other thing was I tried to think of how do you create a studio that didn't exist? And my thought was, well, there were plenty of independent producers who were between the cracks, who didn't have a studio. And that's what I settled on. I always had the scheme in my head, and I don't understand why this doesn't exist in the real world. So many businesses that we take for granted, McDonald's, Pizza, Chef, they're actually real estate ventures. It's really the real estate that's important, not the fast food being delivered. That's a vehicle that generates revenue, but it's a real estate undertaking. So my idea was, well, what about if it's a film producer who was a real estate agent? And whether the movie made money or not didn't matter, because his bread and butter was turning over properties. And if you own a property and you're going to make a film there, you can destroy it, you can renovate it, you can do whatever you want on that property in the production of the film, and you've got a carpentry crew that's going to do the repairs and make it presentable and sellable.
And it's all part of the budget.
It's all part of the budget, and it's all part of the financing scheme where he can actually play with being a producer and actually producing films that actually get distributed, but that's gravy. That's like the fringe business for this individual. Also, you, Stephen, Mark, and Tim were having the fun of writing a horror story. And to me, it's like, well, the framing story had to be more than just a frame. The best Amicus films, and I'm thinking of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and From Beyond the Grave, both of which have Peter Cushing as the character who is the omniscient party who knows what's really going on. So that the twist in the tale would mean I'm getting to tell a horror story that has a kick at the end of the book as well. And that to me was necessary if this was going to work as an anthology that wasn't just a collection of 4 novellas, that
Right.
actually worked the way these Amicus films work.
So providing this in-depth, textured history as if this film studio was real, connecting it to existing films and directors and producers and actors, and at the same time always weaving in the thing that's going to become your horror story
Right.
by the time the thing is over.
It also means Blythewood had to be a character.
Right.
Right.
The
This
founder,
producer,
yes.
Lawrence Blythewood, I had to make him work
Right.
as a character. The interviewer is the reader.
Right.
You know, the interviewer is sort of a non-character. There's enough about the interviewer at the beginning, I hope, the prologue, that he works as a character. But he needs to become invisible because what leads the reader through is Lawrence Blythewood talking about these films that each novella is the presentation to the reader
Right.
of the film that never existed.
Well, and we talked earlier about the fact that I have not read the other 3 novellas. I've read all of your pieces.
I think I'm the only person
I wrote-
on
you
the
may
team
be,
that's read
other than the
all
publisher.
the novellas plus the framing because
Yeah,
I had
and
to stitch it together.
You had to do that, and so but because I can't wait to hold it in my book, in my hands as a real thing, and treat it as if these things were real, and that was the fun of writing my piece, which is called
The Devil's Circus.
The Devil's Circus, and it's inspired, in fact, by many things, but the 3 things in particular are all Hammer films: The Reptile, The Gorgon, and most especially Vampire Circus.
Right.
And I just, it's the tone of it, it's the atmosphere, while writing it, I was even thinking, okay, what could they have shot? Like
Right.
what were the traditional sets used for these things? You have the little stone bridge over a river, and you have, the things that you would see in those films. I was thinking, what could I do that would have been within their budget?
The tiny circus.
Yeah, exactly. the
With
tiny
finite
circus.
number of tents.
Yes, exactly.
And, the fun of working it too is with your story, Devil's Circus. The chronology, the order they appear is Mark Morris's The Devil's Sword is the first. The Demon's Sword.
Right.
The Devil's Circus. Tim's is castle, a castle setting. Stephen's is a contemporary setting, Stephen
Right.
Bowles. And so the fun for me was recognizing the cues each of you were planting, but expanding upon that. Like when I have Lawrence Blythewood talking about Devil's Circus, I had the idea of, well, what if these creatures that you have inhabiting the circus, these demonic clowns,
Right.
have something bizarre about their shadows? And I realized, well, low-budget movie. So they had the seamstress stitch cloth shadows to the feet of the actors.
Right. So that while they're shooting, they can.
It
right.
looks odd,
Yeah.
and it's almost subliminal,
Right.
but nobody would really notice it consciously. And
Right.
those were the little
because they couldn't
things.
afford to do it.
Well, it's a cheap
right.
way of doing
Right,
it, right?
exactly,
And the thing to remind readers today is this is all pre-digital cinema.
Mm-hmm.
This is when the only way it was going to be on the screen is if it was in front of the camera,
Right.
or if you spent money on opticals and miniatures.
Right.
So
we could talk about this for hours.
we won't.
But I want to make sure that we get in a conversation about the other book. We haven't said Studio of Screams is coming out from PS Publishing in the UK. You're able to order from them online. PS Publishing. Your other book that we're talking about briefly is
It's a nonfiction book.
a nonfiction book. Tell us about this book and that series of books.
Okay, with Studio of Screams, it was a collaborative effort where there was no one editor, right? All 4 of you came to me and invited me to be involved. In the other book that's coming out from PS Publications, I'm part of an imprint that's called the Midnight Movie Monograph, and it's a whole line of books that Neil Snowden, a British author and editor, has pulled together, and they've done 8 to 10 volumes already, and each of them is a slim book on a particular film: Theater of Blood, My friend Tim Lucas did a terrific monograph on the Poe film Spirits of the Dead. They've done Phantomos. They've done Deathline, which was released in America as Raw Meat. It's like these cult movies that don't get a lot of attention by and large. Neil Snowden came to me and said, I'd like you to do the book on Carnival of Souls, which is a 1962 American film that's a ghost movie, essentially. And my response was, well, Neil, I'll do Carnival of Souls if you want me to, but I really would like to write about David Cronenberg's The Brood, which was his third horror feature.
We have the French poster.
The French poster is behind us. It was
behind
released in France and Spain and Italy as Chromosome 3.
Okay.
And this was a movie that came out in 1979, and I wanted to write about this instead of Carnival of Souls first because The Brood was personally important to me. And it's David Cronenberg's third feature horror film. It stars Oliver Reed and Samantha Eggar. And it is a movie involving an imaginary form of psychotherapy in which people physically manifest their emotions on their body. If you've got bottled up anger, lesions form on your skin. Cancer may begin to manifest physiologically as part of your body. And Cronenberg took it to a whole level of externalizing a person's rage. And it was just a really powerful, important film to me. I first saw it in the early 80s, 80, 81, and I never forgot it. And it became a film that was sort of a lifeline to me. I was going through a really difficult period in my first marriage with my first wife dealing with recovered memories. Right. And it was affecting all of us in the family, our children, their grandparents, our parents. And The Brood became this sort of anchor of like how to negotiate my own very difficult, very confused emotions during this period. And I ended up doing a monograph that Neil Stone encouraged me to keep going with, and it is their first 670-page monograph.
So it's a 670-page slim volume.
It is the size of 5 of their books put together.
That does not surprise me, knowing you and knowing your knowledge of the...
It's not just that. I went deep. Like, I wanted to find out, like, where did this idea for this film come from? What are the cultural roots? Not just the genre roots.
You did a lot of interviews on top of...
I interviewed the cinematographer. I interviewed 2 of the performers, the star Art Hindle and Cindy Hines, who played the little girl in the family that The Brood revolves around. And I really tried to track sort of the lifespan of a single creative work because, a novel isn't just a novel. It comes from somewhere. And sometimes the roots go back in history, predating the author's life. And I really believe that tracking those kind of cultural roots is important. And also I track what followed. A movie like The Brood, it wasn't a big hit. It wasn't like The Exorcist, right? Barely registered when it came out, got horrible reviews, was panned.
But it made its impact.
It made its impact, and it's never gone away. And
I actually watched it, rewatched it last night with my son Dan, who's 24. So he has now seen that.
You've now spread the contagion.
Exactly, of The Brood. Yeah, exactly.
So this is it's sort of a companion volume to Studio of Screams in a way because I'm trying to chart where does this kind of work come from and where does it go. And in Studio of Screams, we collaboratively did it with a fictional studio. And in the case of the Midnight Movie monograph on David Cronenberg's The Brood, it's, what's the canvas of a single actual film? And where did it come from and where does it go? So.
No, that's fantastic. Both books are available from PS Publishing.
It's pspublishing.co.uk.
And that's fantastic. And I just want to say thank you for spending time with us, Steve.
Thanks for having me. It's great being had, Chris.
All right. We'll talk again soon. Thank you very much.